Police officer, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. She is charged in Sunday's shooting death of Daunte Wright during that traffic stop. She is charged with second-degree manslaughter and is currently out on bail. Brooklyn Center police say she shot Wright when she grabbed her firearm instead of her taser. And we'll bring you all the details from that Zoom appearance as soon as we get them. But I want to get us now to the Derek Chauvin murder trial. The prosecution and the defense now have officially rested, but not before Chauvin himself, the former Minneapolis police officer charged in the death of George Floyd, decided to invoke his Fifth Amendment right, choosing not to testify. Joining me now, CNN's Josh Campbell outside of the courthouse. And Josh, I know they all come back into that courtroom on Monday, but this weekend, that jury has a whole lot to process.
They certainly do, and after hearing from so many different witnesses, it's clear that members of this jury are hearing competing theories of this case. We heard from a number of prosecution witnesses, very damning testimony from medical experts saying that the cause of death in this case was the action of that officer, Derek Chauvin, on George Floyd. They also heard from police use of force experts talking about what they saw on that video was not within department policy. And of course, when the defense got their opportunity to make their case, it was a complete 180. They were trying to bring up additional theories about what may have happened, everything from possible was the action of that officer, Derek Chauvin, on George Floyd. They also heard from police use of force experts talking about what they saw on that video was not within department policy. And of course, when the defense got their opportunity their case, it was a complete 180. They were trying to bring up additional theories about what may have happened, everything from possible drug use by George Floyd to heart disease to this idea that maybe this idling police car, its exhaust was at play. So as you say, a lot to think about here. We're expecting closing arguments to take place on Monday. Now today also we heard Derek Chauvin, his own voice. He was asked by the judge in a series of questions and questioned by his own lawyer about whether he wanted to actually testify in this trial. Take a listen to what he said.
I have advised you, and we have gone back and forth on the matter, would be kind of an understatement, right?
Yes, it is.
But after a lengthy meeting last night, we had some further discussion, agreed?
Correct.
And have you made a decision today whether you intend to testify or whether you intend to invoke your Fifth Amendment privilege?
I will invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege today.
Mr. Chauvin, I'm going to address you directly because the decision whether or not to testify, let me take this off, is entirely yours. In other words, it's a personal right. Mr. Nelson makes a lot of the decisions in trial, but one he cannot make for you is whether or not you testify. And he can give you advice, and you can take that advice or reject that advice. But the decision ultimately has to be yours and not his. Is this your decision not to testify?
It is, Your Honor.
Now, we are finished with all the witnesses in this case, and the jury will not be hearing from Derek Chauvin. We expect closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense to take place on Monday. Then the jury will be sequestered for the duration of their deliberation. And of course, we never know how long juries will take. We don't know what that dynamic will be inside the room, how many questions they will have, and whether all of them will unanimously come to some type of decision. It's interesting, though, the last thing that they heard from the judge before they went on the weekend recess is the judge said that next week you will have to pack a suitcase as you are sequestered. If you're wondering about how long it's going to take, plan for long, hope for short. Brooke?
Josh, thank you. Back with me, Ellie Honig and Commissioner Ramsey. And so, Ellie, just first to you, closing arguments Monday. Who do you think has presented the strongest case?
Well, I think the prosecution has to be very happy with how their case has come in so far. If you divide it into sort of the three major components, you had your eyewitnesses and your videos. There's really essentially no dispute about what happened on the street that day. Then the use of force, highlighted by the police chief. Other senior members of the Minneapolis PD made very clear that Chauvin's actions were unacceptable, abusive, excessive. And then finally, the medical causation. We heard from 4 or 5 medical experts who said, of course, Derek Chauvin's actions were a major cause. The only thing I want people to keep in mind, though, is A, you never know what a jury's going to do. A jury is just 12 human beings. They are unpredictable. And B, this is not like an athletic contest where it's who scored more points, because the prosecution always bears that burden of proving its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the standard here.
Chief, what do you make of Chauvin not testifying?
Well, I mean, I think he made the right decision for himself, because he would have been ripped to shreds on cross-examination by the prosecution. I mean, they demonstrated for the last 2 weeks their skill at questioning witnesses on cross-examination. He would have opened himself up, not only for this incident, but for other issues in his background. So from his point of view, I don't see what he could have gained from testifying, because how do you justify his actions? I mean, 9 minutes and 29 seconds on a guy who's not resisting. If this had been a short duration, something that occurred rapidly, where you can start the split-second decision type thing, or even a minute or two of wrestling with an individual, that's not the case here, and you just can't justify it. And so he's better off not testifying, although prosecution probably wished he would, because they would give him a good opportunity there. But, someone asked me earlier, is Chauvin worried? I would imagine so, but there are 3 other officers that were at the scene that day that should be worried as well.
Appreciate that point. Ellie, let's go back to the big moment today when the prosecution tried to admit this new evidence about the level of carbon monoxide in George Floyd's blood. And just remember, the defense's expert witness yesterday, suggested that it was the exhaust from the police car, the squad car right there, that played a role in his death. And the judge allowed the prosecution to bring back Dr. Tobin, but he said, quote, if he even hints that there are test results that the jury has not heard of, it's going to be a mistrial. Big moment. Explain this to the viewers.
Yeah, so the bottom line point here is there are no surprises at trial. More specifically, the prosecution does not get to surprise the defendant at trial. You have an obligation as a prosecutor to turn over to the defendant all of your evidence in advance so they can know what's coming, so they can prepare for it. We heard the testimony yesterday about the carbon monoxide. The prosecution today said, actually, we've recently tested George Floyd's blood, or it's recently been retested, and it conclusively disproves the carbon monoxide theory. The judge said, too bad, too late. You should have done that long ago. The defendant should have known about this long ago. You can't spring it on them now. Instead, the judge allowed them to recall Dr. Tobin, who gave still effective testimony. He said, in my opinion, it's very unlikely. That's not as good as a blood test that conclusively disproves it, though. But that's an important feature of our trial process here. No surprises for the defendant.
But, Commissioner, in your 40 years in policing, have you ever heard of anyone suffering from carbon monoxide after being arrested near a squad car?
I haven't. I mean, the only time I was in homicide for a while, obviously with suicides, that's something that occurs, or accidental, people in a house, with a faulty furnace or something. But as far as during an arrest, normally a person's not even on the ground long enough to have any kind of effect from carbon monoxide. So this is highly unusual. Is it impossible? Nothing's impossible. I've not heard of it.
Ellie, quickly, closing arguments beginning Monday. What do you expect?
If you're the prosecution, you have to bring the jury back. Time moves very slowly in trial. This case is only 2.5 weeks old, but it feels like it started 6 months ago. And so you have to bring the jury back to that street, to those witnesses, to those videos. Common sense. If you're the prosecution, you are saying you, members of the jury, can and must use your common sense here. That's what it all comes down to.
And then last question again to you. What's the rough rule of thumb in terms of expecting a verdict?
I chuckle because I've seen juries come back in 45 minutes with a verdict, and I've seen juries go 2 weeks without a verdict. So there's no way to tell. I'm guessing, if I had to guess, we'll see a verdict by the end of next week.
All right, Ellie, Commissioner, thank you so much. Coming up here, Congressman Jim Jordan is on the attack today, berating Dr. Anthony Fauci in this House hearing on COVID. We will show you what happened when Congresswoman Maxine Waters stepped up to shut it down.